Well, it's Palm Sunday. That's what it says on the Christian calendar. And for me, growing up as a Catholic child, Palm Sunday was always a special day because we got to do something interesting and special and different at church. Everyone, when they entered the church, would receive a palm leaf, or I guess they call them a palm frond. And growing up in Wisconsin, there were no palm trees, so it just added to the mystique and the specialness of the day to get this palm frond. Didn't even know what a palm tree looked like other than what I'd see on TV. And Wisconsin people are, shall we say, rather restrained. I once heard Garrison Keillor refer to folks from Wisconsin and Minnesota as God's frozen chosen or something like that. So rather reserved, and so we really didn't do much of anything with the palm leaves during church except to hold them rather stoically during the service. There was no waving them around or anything like that, although I do seem to recall some attempts at sword fighting with the palm leaf with my brother and the other kids, which was frowned upon. But when you got home, it was traditional to take the palm fronds and you would braid them a certain way. You'd use it either to decorate the crucifix that was supposed to be hanging on the wall of every good Catholic's home, or you could actually make a cross out of it. I think we have an example up here, something that looks like that. My mother was really good at it. She tried to teach me how, but I never quite got the hang of it. And I find it interesting that we still call it Palm Sunday because there's only one of the four Gospels that actually says that the people were greeting Jesus with palm branches. That was the Gospel of John. All four of the Gospels talk about this triumphal entry into Jerusalem, but John is the only one that actually mentions palm branches. And he doesn't even say what they did with them, if they waved them, if they were fanning themselves with them, or maybe put them down on the road before him, as we seem to think traditionally. In Matthew and Mark, they call them oak branches, not palms. And Luke has no tree branches whatsoever. The people just took their cloaks off and laid them across the road, which means, I guess, that we could just as easily call this Cloak Sunday, based on what they say. So sometimes we know this, that the four Gospels will conflict with each other on the details like that. But the gist of the story is the same in all four of them. Jesus is entering Jerusalem. It's the start of Passover week. It's the start of his last week on planet Earth, and there's this huge demonstration of support for him. People took notice of him once he arrived, which is because he had this reputation. Jesus was known to draw crowds when he went around the countryside teaching his message. In a world of Roman imperial domination, he had a message that caused people to pay attention. He had a message of hope, a message that perhaps this occupation might end someday. The mighty Roman Empire was in control of the promised land, and the once proud and free independent Israelites were forced to pay tribute to this guy named Caesar. And then they had to live under the occupation of the Roman army. But the Jewish people had hope. They had hope because their scriptures promised that there would be a mighty hero. There was this prophecy that a Messiah or an anointed one was going to come and would deliver them from their enemies and turn Israel back into a superpower that it had once been under David and Solomon and different kings back in the good old days. And there were a number of people who thought that maybe, just maybe, Jesus was going to be that hero. So, when he arrived in Jerusalem the week of Passover, they gave him this hero's welcome. You know, Jesus had spent the preceding months going around the countryside talking about how their world was going to change, and in a big way. He had been telling people about what he called the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, and all these things about how the mighty would be brought low, the first would be last, the last would be first, and so on and so forth. And it was all supposed to happen during the lifetimes of the people that he was speaking to. It says so very explicitly in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the passage is translated the same in all 3 of these. It reads like this: "Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." Well, that generation has most certainly passed away, and those things didn't happen. Things didn't get better, they got worse. Much worse. Not only did this kingdom of heaven not appear, but the guy who said it was going to happen was executed by the enemy, the Romans. You know, it's hard to imagine how Christianity managed to survive those events. Jesus appeared to be a false, or at least a failed prophet, but thanks to some very impressive legwork by Paul and quick thinking by the early church, Christianity not only survived, it thrived. And the real irony is that it was the Roman Empire itself that carried Christianity to the ends of the known earth. The same Roman Empire that executed Jesus became the vehicle that was used by his followers to spread the new religion, to spread his message of peace and love and joy. You know, if someone had written this as a screenplay and shopped it around Hollywood, they would have been told that it's far-fetched, too far-fetched. Nobody would believe it. But often, you know, fact is often stranger than fiction. And there is a good amount of history here, and I think history is fascinating, because history does indeed repeat itself. You know, let's think for a minute about what happened to Christianity after it won over the Roman Empire. The same Roman Empire that had oppressed Israel and persecuted the early Christians. What happened after that? Well, Christianity became an empire. Institutionalized Christianity then went on a campaign of persecution, and dare I say oppression, because I don't know what else you would call the Crusades and the Inquisitions and burning heretics at the stake and things like that. And of course, before all that happened, we go back in time to see how the Israelites got into the Holy Land. They escaped their oppressors in Egypt, arrived in the Holy Land, and proceeded to displace the people who were already living there. So there's this, I almost want to call it a vicious circle or a vicious cycle that's been going on for like 5,000 years now, not just in Palestine, but all around the world. People are oppressed, they're persecuted, they manage to escape the oppressor, they're liberated, and then somehow they become the next oppressor. And I would hate to think that it's an unavoidable part of the human condition, but isn't that the way it appears sometimes? And that's the reason we keep telling these stories. You know, in many ways, we're seeing the human condition being presented in the form of an archetype or pattern that lives on in these stories. And it's a cautionary tale, things that we can still learn from these stories. We want to learn from history in an effort to keep it from repeating itself so often. Back in 1992, a theologian named Walter Wink wrote a wonderful book called Engaging the Powers. There he is, Engaging the Powers, Discernment and Resistance in a World of Domination. I've been working with his ideas, ever since I got into this line of work. And Walter Wink sees Jesus as a spiritual leader who tried to break that vicious cycle of persecution, liberation, and conquest again. You know, Jesus may have been wrong about the time frame and the precise sequence of events, but he got some very important things right. And these are the things that we still need to look at and listen to. We still need to tell these stories. One of the things that Jesus got right was the need to confront the oppressor, to stand up to a misuse or abuse of power. That's what he was doing when he traveled to Jerusalem on what we call Palm Sunday. He makes his triumphal entry into the city, and then the very next day, what does he do? He heads over to the temple where he makes this big show of throwing the merchants and the money changers out in front of hundreds of onlookers, watching him cleansing the temple, as they call it. It was a demonstration. It was a message. It was a plea, really, to not let money and greed and materialism corrupt the temple, or symbolically the larger culture. The temple is the temple of the body, the larger culture. Jesus had identified a big part of the reason why that cycle of oppression and liberation keeps repeating itself so often in human history. It's because people have been fooled into believing crazy ideas. And crazy ideas have a corrupting influence. In the temple on that day, the crazy idea, the corrupting influence was money, greed, materialism. Professor Wink calls an oppressive military empire like Rome, he calls it a domination system. A domination system. And you see, they don't just dominate you physically, they actually get inside your head. They get inside your head with a whole bunch of crazy ideas that Professor Wink calls delusional assumptions. So if Jesus was going to deliver us from anything, he was going to deliver us from the delusional assumptions that were at the core, was the cause of this cycle of liberation, conquest, oppression, and so on and so on. They get into your head with delusional assumptions, and it's a control mechanism. It's a control mechanism. Force is always part of control, but the war of ideas is even more important. So Jesus wanted to attack the delusional assumptions. This is how Professor Wink talks about it in the book. He says, people would not be so acquiescent in their own oppression unless they were caught in a powerful delusion. Delude is from the Latin deludere, to play, to defraud, to befool the mind of judgment so as to cause what is false to be accepted as true. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Isn't that what Jesus said? And this concept of delusional assumptions is not unique to Jesus or Walter Wink for that matter. The Buddha was dealing with them in his part of the world. If you study Buddhism, you hear them talking about delusion a lot. Now, the Buddha wasn't approaching it in the same way as Jesus, but his entire message was centered around stepping out of our delusional way of seeing the world and ourselves, and to have this liberation from suffering that's caused by our delusional assumptions. Another place we see this concept is in a little book that's been very popular over the years in unity circles called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. He doesn't use the term delusional assumptions, though. He calls it domestication. A different word, same concept. It's the way that we allow ourselves to be programmed because we want to please people in authority, starting with our parents, right? Here's what Don Miguel says. At an early age, we learn punishment and reward and form an image of perfection in order to try to be good enough to get the reward. We live by an image of how we should be in order to be accepted by everybody else, and our fear of being rejected becomes the fear of not being good enough. And of course, we all know that fear can drive us to believe a lot of things that we ought not believe. You know, others can learn how to take advantage of that tendency for their own purposes. Don Miguel says that in many cases we willingly buy into the delusion, but there's also an element of deception going on. People learn how to use that to deceive us. Now, the late, great Carl Sagan, he had a colorful word for it. He called it the bamboozle. This is from his 1995 book called The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. He says, one of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. That may be one of the reasons why the cycle seems to go on. Advertising, religion, politics, they can all take advantage of our tendency to be bamboozled. They can all take advantage of our tendency to buy into delusional assumptions because people are much easier to control that way. And the problem is that even when people manage to escape from physical domination, they are still carriers of the assumption. Viruses come in many forms. The crazy ideas, the delusional assumptions are like a virus. So again, it's no wonder that the cycle continues. The oppressed become the next domination system because they still operate based on the delusional assumptions. They're still infected. Jesus, like the Buddha, thought that this cycle could be stopped, that liberation was possible. And this was a message that he was willing to die for, and he did. The metaphor, again, that he used for this liberation was the kingdom of heaven. And actually, Jesus didn't himself, I don't think, that he thought of it as a metaphor. Because there's evidence that he really believed that God was going to intervene and to give us some supernatural help sorting things out, so to speak. You know, the Romans weren't just going to put down their weapons and cooperate, so it was going to take some supernatural persuasion. Now, like I said earlier, there were some things that Jesus got wrong, but this is what we can take away from all of this. These are the things that he got right. You see, even though he thought that he was going to get some divine assistance in setting things up, he made it very clear that people would still have to change the way they were thinking and behaving if they wanted to be a part of what was going to happen. So, it always starts as an inside job, and it's one that we have to undertake at the level of what? Consciousness. There it is again. It's a compelling story, this Palm Sunday and Easter week adventure. It's a compelling story. It's still relevant, and it's still very useful once we get rid of some of the religious baggage. And next week, we're going to try to do the same thing for Easter. So Karen mentioned earlier the little project we're going to have. We'll get that out in an email to you describing what it is. So for those of you who want to participate in our Easter ritual, which is going to be a little bit different this year, and we hope to see you then.